If everyone could please take their seats and silence their phones, that would be greatly appreciated. My name is Colin Deeds. I am the Assistant Director at the U of A Center for Latin American Studies, and I am here to help move things along today. So it's my pleasure to welcome the Latin American Studies Director, the Interim Director, the Professor of Latin American Studies and Geography, Dr. Margaret Wilder, and she's going to say a few words of welcome and introduction before we get started with our program today. So Dr. Wilder, thank you so much for being here and representing Latin American Studies.
Thanks, Colin. So muy buenas tardes a todos y todas. Gracias por estar con nosotros por este evento inaugural. Welcome, everyone. Really thrilled to see such a lovely group of people here for this inaugural event of Paths Across the Pacific Speaker Series, a brand new series in this amazingly lovely space. So this event was made possible with generous funding from the U.S. Department of Education's Title VI National Resource Center grants. And CLASS, the Center for Latin American Studies, has been privileged to administer these funds on and off in 4-year cycles for over 20 years. We've had a lot of success with Title VI and hope to have more in the future to build our Latin American Studies programs and offerings. We are delighted that our colleagues on campus were also awarded Title VI funds to help build the new Center for East Asian Studies. Their team worked really hard to secure this highly competitive grant, awarded to fewer than 20 institutions of higher education nationally. We congratulate them on their success and look forward to many more collaborations like today's event. And before I turn the floor over to my esteemed colleague from SEAS, I would like to recognize and thank all the organizations and the individuals who made today's event possible. The event is presented by the Center for Latin American Studies and the Center for East Asian Studies with the assistance of our friends at La UNAM Centro de Estudios Mexicanos here on campus, led by its new director, Dr. Catalina Stearns, who is here with us today, I believe. Thank you, welcome. And a special thanks to Consul Rafael Barcelo and his team from the Tucson Consulate. Thank you for being here. And we also appreciate the support of Dr. Javier Duran, one of my colleagues in the center, and he is also the director of the U of A Confluence Center for Creative Inquiry. Gracias, Javier. And Dr. Luis Coronado Well of the SBS Office of Mexico Initiatives. So Luis is always a great supporter and keeps all of our events going throughout the year, Mexico-related events. Numerous other individuals dedicated their time and energy to making this event a success. The first person I want to mention is big hand for for Colin Deeds, my colleague and our assistant director in Latin American Studies, who's made a huge effort to make today happen. Also Dr. Katrina Dillon, who I believe it might be outside, Cristal Natera from LAS, David Kawabata from SEAS, and Alice Yu from SEAS. Thanks also to the building staff here in HSIB and U of A Catering for hosting us. And please welcome Dr. Wenhao Diao, Associate Professor of East Asian Studies and the founding director of the U of A Center for East Asian Studies.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. So I'm Wenhao Diao. I am the co-director for Center for East Asian Studies. As Margaret has mentioned, we're brand new, not even 1 year old. So Colin wanted me here to briefly talk about how this idea began, the Path Across the Pacific series. Really, it began as something like, you know what, living in the US sometimes makes you forget that there are other countries. And even when you realize there are other countries, it seems like their only relationships that matter are their relationships with the US. And I think what we want to do as Title VI centers, by the way, that's not a very good joke. What we want to do at Title VI centers is really trying to to help folks realize that there's a lot more to that. And we're fortunate to have both Title VI centers on this campus, and being so close to the border, the US-Mexico border here, I think we're uniquely positioned to talk about the complexities, the nuances, and the histories of the relationship between East Asia and Latin America. So this is actually only the very first one, the first installment of the Path Across the Pacific series. And we plan to have this at least go on for the next 3 years, and we hope to have it as an ongoing effort. And thank you again for coming here today, and I'm very excited. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Diao. I really appreciate that, and we really appreciate your collaboration, and are looking forward to many more years of working together. So, we had originally hoped that our friend, the Mexican ambassador to China, and UNAM professor, Dr. Jesús Seade KurI, would be with us here in person today. Unfortunately, due to a long overdue and COVID-delayed swearing-in ceremony with the president of China, Xi Jinping, happening next week, he was not able to travel with us, so he had to cancel at the last minute. He provided a video, but to compound things, we had some technical difficulties with the audio. So instead, fortunately, our very good friend and the best Mexican consul that I've ever known, Consul Rafael Barceló, has generously agreed to say a few words in the place of the ambassador. Consul Barceló is a great friend of the university, a great friend of the Center for Latin American Studies, a great friend of Tucson as well. And he's just a great person. He was originally appointed to this post here in Tucson in 2020 after he served as the Deputy Director General for International Policy on Human Rights at the Mexico's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He is from Sonora. He has a law degree from the University of Hermosillo and a master's in public policy by the Centro de Investigaciones y Docencia Económicas, the Seade, in Mexico City. He's also studied at Columbia University in exchange, and he's taught seminars here at the U of A. So we are really fortunate to have Consul Barceló here with us as a great friend and colleague and collaborator. So Consul Barceló is going to sort of introduce the issues, frame the topic from the sort of diplomatic political perspective, and then we're going to invite our guest speaker from UNAM, Dr. Mariana Escalante, to focus more on the cultural and the linguistic and the differences, right? And then finally we have Dr. Sergio Puig from the law school, and he's going to give us an economic and legal perspective, and then also sort of moderate a conversation between our presenters and hear from the audience as well. So that's our format. We invite you to stick around for the Q&A, and then most importantly afterwards, right, the food and drinks and for the reception outdoors. So thank you again all for being here, and Consul, I'm going to hand the floor over to you and to hear more of your perspective from the diplomatic side of things. So thank you again.
Buenas tardes, good afternoon everyone. There is this show in Mexico, children's show called En Familia con Chabelo. And there was a practice there called la catafixia, where you had to interchange someone for the other one. So normally the contestant lost. And I think you lost when the catafixia was between me and Ambassador Jesús Seade, for sure. But I am very, very happy to be here with you today, also to transmit the regrets that Ambassador Seade had. He was extremely excited about this event, and he had committed to come to Tucson, and then the Directorate of Protocol of the Foreign Affairs Ministry told him he was going to be granted the privilege of being in the first group to present his credentials, which is already something that you cannot refuse, of course. As an ambassador, you will never refuse that because that is totally against diplomatic practice. So he changed, or with the very valuable efforts of Colin and the team of the university, they changed only for the directorate to say that they could not be outside China for 10 days before the presentation. So that totally took us the opportunity for having Ambassador Seade here, but I'm very sure he will come. I think this is an inaugural series of conversations, very much needed conversations about this path and crossroads between the Pacific. They are not new. Mexico has had direct trade with China and other Asian countries since the beginning of the colonial times. So this goes for centuries, and it's not something new. I think normally we commit this sin of presentism. We think that the present is the most complex age that the humankind has had to endure, and then you go back in time and then you see it's not the case. But certainly we have some complexities. I will start this conversation from the diplomatic point of view saying Mexico and Latin America, as they did in the past, they are not willing nor able to form teams in a geopolitical warfare, being ideological warfare or being a warfare of the worst kind. So for Latin American countries, it is very important to find a way that the powers find a way so the world can move forward together. And it's something I think very important for both the United States and China to understand. They cannot, and you will see that a lot in the political analysis that you will see in the media. It's like looking if a government is pro-China, it's pro-United States. The approach is what is incorrect. Countries don't have to take one or the other team. Countries might wish for different ways to achieve prosperity. I think for most of the societies, for most of the peoples, what it's important, it is actually to achieve prosperity for their own people. I think it is very important for any great power in the world to understand that. And that is correct now, and that was correct in the past, and that will keep happening in the future. It's like we, particularly the Latin American countries, will be reluctant to enter as much as they can, because that's a complexity that it comes in very different forms. But they will be reluctant to enter this, as I have to align myself with one side of the other. Of course, here I think it is very important to understand what has been the role of Mexico in the international arena. Mexico sees itself as a country of multiple belongings. We never want to enter in one box. So Mexico is a North American country. Its economy, their families are formed in a very North American way. But our culture is very Latin American. We're also a Caribbean country. Mexico is a Caribbean country, and Mexico is a Pacific country. We have we have been part of APEC from the beginning. Also, Mexico is it's an Atlantic country. So we really have multiple belongings, and we have always seen ourselves as a bridge. So I think it is something very important to understand, both from the United States and China, that Mexico can be a very valuable bridge. And you don't want to take down the bridges. You want to strengthen the bridges, particularly those bridges that are where you can trust in them. I think that from the geopolitical point of view, it is a very relevant position that Mexico will keep playing in this perhaps complex relationship that is going to be formed, that is going to have different episodes. Let me also try to contextualize that Mexico is also I think in this area, I don't have to contextualize how deeply intertwined our economies are from the US and Mexico, our societies. Some of our regulations are actually very much intertwined because of our trade agreements that we've had for the last 30 years. But Mexico, from a commercial point of view, is also very much close to China. Not as much as most of the Latin American countries, but certainly in a very intense way. Mexico and China are celebrating their 50th anniversary of the establishing of diplomatic relationship. At the same time, we're celebrating 200 bilateral relationships with the United States. But as I mentioned before, Mexico, since the colony, or what it was called then the New Spain, had forms of relationship with Japan, with the Philippines, and China. So Mexico and China, they don't have a free trade agreement as we do with the United States, but Mexico and China have a comprehensive strategic alliance or association, which is also very important in forms of political dialogue and in form of economic dialogue. Of course, for trade, China is the third partner of Mexico. The United States is by far the first. The second one is Canada. And in 2018 and 2019, the bilateral trade actually growth between Mexico and China growth into historical records to $90,000 million. And of course, in 2020, with COVID, that decreased, but that didn't decrease as much as with other countries. That decreased only 9.5%, which for a COVID year is not a lot. But in 2021, the exports of Mexico to China had an increase of almost 30% if you compare these numbers with those registered in 2019. So actually, it is a very healthy trade relationship that we've had. Of course, there's a lot of Chinese investments and investments from other Asian countries that want to participate in the North American market. They are investing in Mexico as a way to keep producing and take advantage of the USMCA, the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement. It is in this, and so the foreign direct investment from China in Mexico is $413 million in 2021. That is an increase of almost 100% if you compare that with the former year. So there is a significant growth in foreign direct investments. There is significant growth in Mexican exports to China, particularly in agricultural products. And also, there is a very healthy political relationship in a very complex scenario for Mexico because, of course, our most important diplomatic relationship is with the United States. There's no doubt in that. But as I mentioned, Mexico won't participate in a form of geopolitics that alienates from one or the other powers. It is actually keep growing its interest in being a very strategic bridge to keep together the North and the South and the East and the West. And actually, there is people in Mexico advocating, and I have to say this in Spanish because I'm not sure if you can translate that. But they said Mexico has been for a while norteado. Okay, norteado means a little bit lost, but means also looking to the north. So ahora necesita orientarse. Now it needs to orient itself. So there's people claiming that you cannot build a middle emerging power like Mexico aspires to do if you only see to one point and not to the other sides of the equation. And I think our tradition of multiple belongings is going to be a fundamental role for Mexico continuing to be a very trustworthy and a strategic bridge also between Mexico and China. So thank you so much for your attention, and I'm really looking forward for the rest of the conversation.
Thank you so much, Consul Barcelona. That was great. I love that, norteado, orientado. I saw multiple people taking notes, so you better patent or copyright that one. So it's really a pleasure for me to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Mariana de Jesús Escalante. She is a full-time professor at the Center for International Relations of the Faculty of Political and Social Sciences at the UNAM University. She obtained her PhD in political sciences from UNAM and a master's in international relations from Peking University. In the Chinese program there. Dr. Escalante is a member of the National System of Researchers of the National Council of Science and Technology of Mexico, and her lines of research focus on Chinese foreign policy, Chinese nationalism, Confucianism, contemporary Chinese society, mutual perspectives between China and Mexico, and women in China. So today she's going to talk to us more about how to understand the relationship with China from a Mexican perspective. So, Dr. Escalante, thank you so much for coming all the way from Mexico City to visit and be with us today. And I look forward to your talk. And thank you.
Perfect, thank you. Can you see me? Because I'm not as tall as my previous colleagues. Okay, well, thank you very much for being here. Good afternoon, colleagues of the Center for Latin American Studies, for the Center of East Asian Studies, from the Centro de Estudios Mexicanos of UNAM, and the Mexican Consul in Mexico, Rafael Barceló, and thank you for your words as well. It is an honor to be here today to speak to you about the relationship between China and Mexico. When I was invited to this inaugural series of Pathways Across the Pacific, I asked myself how the Mexico-China relationship serves the Trans-Pacific dialogue, but above all, I wanted to know how, without repeating what is constantly being said, I could establish lines of thought that might be of interest to us all, and clarify what its relationship with China means for Mexico. For the next 20 or some minutes, we will move our way from the commonplace from which the bilateral relationship is generally approached, which is the strategic partnership, the economic ties, the challenges, the opportunities. Instead, I will share some insights from my studies on the China-Mexico relationship, which focus on aspects that are sometimes neglected. For that reason, the title of this talk is How to Understand the Relationship with China from a Mexican Perspective. In Chinese, there is a chengyu, or four-character phrase, 同修共济, which refers to a close relationship. This is one where there are common interests and also the same sufferings. In diplomacy and almost all discourses on bilateral relations, similar literary figures are chosen, speaking of cooperation, friendship, and strategic relations. I have chosen this chengyu I quoted before because a similar idea has framed the ongoing discourse alluding to diplomatic relations between Mexico and China. Last year, as our consul mentioned, marked 50 years of diplomatic ties. And to add to the good omens, the anniversary date is Valentine's Day. So you can imagine how this date is used to further embellish the discourse of the relationship. Most of the discourses focus on the millennia of both cultures, their contributions to humanity, their parallel histories, and the common suffering. Even in academia, we usually see research and discussions about the many challenges and opportunities without delving into the implications of this Manichaean discussion. It seems as if when talking about the relationship between these two economies, all that can be mentioned are trade balance indexes, markets, competition, and complementarity, and everything else seems to escape the frame. The so-called century of humiliation for China, which began from the Opium Wars to the triumph of the Communist Party in 1949, had a profound impact on China's foreign policy and its relations with other countries, including Mexico. These experiences have contributed to a strong sense of national identity and pride in China, as well as a desire to assert its power and influence on the international stage. Mexico, likewise, experienced a harsh 300-year colonial history that generated a particular Hispanic heritage that also triggered the construction of its national pride and search for its own identity. Or as the Mexican Nobel laureate Octavio Paz would say, the colony perhaps inherited loneliness, the feeling of orphanhood. Both histories, which are neither shared nor common but parallel, triggered values and sensitivity to principles that are relevant and deserve to be rescued in the bilateral relationship: sovereignty, territorial integrity, and foreign relations based on these principles. Both national histories served as a reminder of the importance of foreign non-interference in their internal affairs and their preference for multilateral, bilateral, and regional cooperation rather than pursuing their interests through intervention. While these values are common ground, the relevance of the bilateral relationship for both countries and for the regions to which we belong lies in the trans-Pacific ties that become possible. I would like to think that the China-Mexico relationship now serves to connect the Asia-Pacific and the Americas as much as it did in the 16th century. Oh, I was supposed to change it before, sorry. Well, this was about the anniversary. And if we wanted to look back to where the relationship began, that is the point in time we would go. The earliest encounters between China and Mexico, at least the ones we have records and evidence of, are those occurring as part of the sea voyages of the Manila Galleon, the first being in 1565. These galleons were named after the city of origin, Manila Galleon or Acapulco Galleon, which was also called the Now of China, because it was almost always full of valuable goods considered to originate in China: tea, silk, porcelain, and spices. From Mexico, silver, tobacco, cocoa, tomatoes, vanilla, and peanuts, among others, were sent back. Trade became so important that Mexican silver became a currency of exchange during the Ming and Qing dynasties. These encounters between Mexico and China were mediated by the Philippines, where most of the ships were built. And although it seems to be merely a route between two Spanish colonies, in reality it marked the beginning of trans-Pacific exchanges, also becoming a globalizing process. These routes continued with great dynamism until the first decade of the 19th century, when they were interrupted by the Mexican War of Independence and the Napoleonic invasion in the Iberian Peninsula and the decline of the Spanish Empire. But the trade for more than 250 years was not only of goods, it was also a vehicle for ideas and cultural practices between the Asia-Pacific region, New Spain, and Europe. Catholicism was known and spread in Asia through missionaries, many of whom departed from the port of Acapulco, which in turn was the space for dispersing Confucianism and Buddhism in America. Artistic interaction was not minor. Chinese and Japanese lacquerware, Philippine textiles, and Chinese porcelain arrived in Mexico, influencing the colors and techniques of Mexican Talavera from the state of Puebla. The food and culinary traditions through their spices were known to both cuisines. In these years, Mexico, due to its geostrategic location and the richness of its lands, was an important center of world trade. The Spanish missionary and poet Bernardo de Balbuena wrote in the first decades of the 17th century a poem entitled Mexican Greatness, which in one part says, "In you, China and Spain are united, Italy with Japan, and finally an entire world in trade and discipline." So Mexico was, in a way, in between Asia and Europe. There were also people, traders, missionaries who stayed on one side of the Pacific or the other, and others who, through the vicissitudes of history, migrated to Mexico. Migration was a central process in the bilateral relationship in contemporary history. In the late 19th and early 20th century, more than 60,000 Chinese settled in Mexico. One of the reasons for this was the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 in the United States. Others fled China because of the prevailing political and socio-economic landscape, such as the imminent fall of the Qing dynasty, the signing of the Treaty of Shimonoseki in 1895, which ended with the First Sino-Japanese War, in which China not only lost Taiwan, but also ceased to be the most powerful country in Asia. In this context, on December of 1899 in Washington, Mexico and China signed the Treaty of Friendship, Commerce, and Navigation, marking the formal beginning of relations that would be eventually suspended some decades after. This period of migration was very important for the bilateral relationship, and it was during this time that imaginaries and perceptions about Chinese people in Mexico were constructed. They came to my country as laborers to build railways and work in the mines during the Porfirian era. Gradually, they became small businessmen, owners of convenience stores and laundries. But the inability to accept what was different, the feeling of being displaced, Mexican poverty, the predominance of the idea of the so-called yellow peril, and the legacy of colonial racism in Mexico led to reprehensible acts, such as the massacre of half of the Chinese population in Torreon, Coahuila in 1911. This disdain for Chinese versus European migration was the result of a process of global colonial domination whose values and ethics predominated in Mexico. After sharing with you these relevant historical events on the first contacts between the two countries and Chinese migration in Mexico, I would like to put emphasis on something that you may have noticed. It is no coincidence that encounters with China since the end of the 19th century were mediated or influenced by the US actions, such as the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 or the first treaty between Mexico and China that was signed, in fact, in Washington. Nor was the establishment of diplomatic relations in 1972. They were not exempt from US influence. This is Echeverría, the president that established relations with China in 1972, for those who don't know, with Mao Zedong. Well, Mao, for sure you know him. So Mexico sensed an imminent rapprochement between China and the United States. And it was no coincidence that bilateral relations were established the same month as Richard Nixon's visit to China. So, as we mentioned earlier, Mexico played a key role from the 16th to the 19th century as the center of these trans-Pacific connections, and I would like to think that although it has changed over time, it still plays an important role because of its proximity to the United States. Although I recognize how Mexico has benefited from the US, it can be said that one of the most important factors why Mexico has not developed a closer relationship with China is the United States. In the last 50 years, it has also been assumed that Mexico's relationship with China is important as a bridge to Latin America, but as we have witnessed, this bridge has been built by other Latin American countries such as Argentina, Chile, and Brazil. In this regard, Lula da Silva's visit to China and his possible incorporation into the Belt and Road Initiative, or the call to put an end to the dollar's monopoly in world trade, are examples of a role that Mexico has not been able to assume. Not that it has to assume, of course. The call to joint initiatives from the Global South, from emerging economies such as the BRICS or China's Belt and Road Initiative, have not received great enthusiasm from the Mexican government. In addition to omissions or ignorance of the possible advantages, in reality, these initiatives challenge the international order led by the United States, with whom we have, of course, the most important bilateral relationship. This background generates a limited capacity for Mexico to move closer to China. With the current Mexican administration, it has become even more evident. President Andrés Manuel López Obrador was asked last year why he did not join BRICS initiative, and his response was, and I quote, "We have good relations with the United States and Canada." No? Chinese President Xi Jinping invited López Obrador to visit China in 2020, and my president replied that because of the distance, the USMCA, and the relationship with the United States, he found it difficult to accept the invitation at that time. The values that supposedly unite China and Mexico, the common elements I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, are only part of diplomatic demagogy. That is to say, I agree the first 50 years of diplomatic ties have worked based on the idea that both countries have hardworking people, a long history, a splendid culture, common sufferings such as colonial aggression, inequality in our societies. But we have to think about whether it is still useful to continue evaluating the bilateral relationship from this perspective. China is Mexico's second largest trading partner and the first in Asia. It is Mexico's third largest export destination, with an annual unfavorable trade balance for Mexico of $107 billion. Mexico and China have had a comprehensive strategic partnership since 2013. And of course, this partnership represents a step beyond the bilateral relationship, greater cooperation in different areas beyond trade ties, also in the political and cultural spheres, and not only bilateral joint actions, but multilateral in the dialogue around global issues such as climate change or sustainable development. Despite this, I insist the trade aspect has been the priority for the bilateral relationship from the Mexican perspective, because it is believed that China can offer a large market, be a strong trading partner, or provide opportunities for Mexican investment. China has also been a competitor for Mexico as well, both in the Mexican and in the North American markets, and a complex actor in the Mexican market due to the worrying invasion of Chinese products that displace Mexican products and the unfavorable trade balance. For example, in 2003, there was a big shock in Mexico because China replaced our country as the second largest trading partner of the United States, even though Mexico was a member of NAFTA. The current phenomenon of nearshoring, where the Chinese are relocating to Mexico to avoid transport problems, geopolitical tensions, circumvent the sanctions imposed by the US, and take advantage of the conditions of the USMCA, makes Mexico a strategic zone once again. The fentanyl issue, on the other hand, drug trafficking and its implication for the trilateral relationship make Mexico's relationship with China more complex. And once again, I insist on the important role played by the United States in this. This is not to draw a simple conclusion about whether Mexico must choose between the two powers, just as our consul mentioned, the United States or China. Our geopolitical situation is obvious, but it is important to think about how we can take advantage of Mexico's relationship with China, which I believe has not been fully understood over the last 50 years. On this end, well, sorry for this academic disruption, but I'm trying to understand how to analyze the relationship. If you can see on this image, not only from the trade and economic perspective, I mean, of course, it's very important, but there are also other factors that can be regarded and that are important for the relationship. So we need to pay more attention to these factors that go beyond what is commonly assumed to be the most important aspect of the relationship. That is how to understand the role played by the United States, which might be even bigger in this image. The image projected of China or Mexico in the news, social networks, which kind of news we read from China and which kind of news they read from us. Political and cultural sensitivity, strategies for attracting tourists, knowledge of the culture, language, and bilateral reciprocity. Fundamental to this are social exchanges that include events, civil acts, and very importantly, educational exchanges and research. Well, of course, I'm an academic, so for me it's the most important part. To give an example, there is an enormous contrast with the study of Asia or China in US universities and Mexico. At my university, the National University, which is the oldest and biggest public university in my country, there are only a few researchers and professors who study China systematically, and even fewer of us who have lived in China for a longer period or speak Chinese. There is still a long way to go. It is important to think that in the next 50 years, that is for the centenary of the relations in 2072, hopefully, we will no longer be talking about the common elements and the past, but about how we were able to take advantage of the institutional mechanisms that already exist, how we were able to make more autonomous decisions, how we followed up on the exchanges between academics, students, and businessmen who know China, and take advantage of aspects in which the relationship can be improved and deepened. It is important to continue thinking about how Mexico can be a trans-Pacific meeting point, at least between Asia and the American continent. That is why I thank the University of Arizona, the Center for Mexican Studies of UNAM, and those who joined us today for making this possible, because through these reflections on the trans-Pacific encounters, we can generate proposals, discussions, and understand alternatives towards the development of our national interests. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Mariana. Thank you. We appreciate you being here. Our next guest is here from the law school, Dr. Sergio Puig. He is the Evo DiConcini Professor of Law. He's also the director of the International Trade and Business Program at the University of Arizona, as well as the co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of International Economic Law. Before he joined the University of Arizona, Sergio was a teaching fellow of the Program of International Legal Studies at Stanford University and served as a lecturer in law at Duke and Stanford universities. Before entering academia, he practiced law in Mexico and in the United States, and he worked at the World Bank and International Center for Investment Disputes. He is also the co-founder and the current vice president of Trade Lab, an organization to facilitate assistance in international trade and investment law matters by law school clinics. And he's also the author of At the Margins of Globalization, Indigenous Peoples in International Economic Law, as well as many articles in specialized journals and book chapters that are available on SSRN and elsewhere. So thank you so much, Dr. Puig, for being with us today. And we look forward to his comments now. And then after he gives some of his perspectives, we'll invite Dr. Escalante and the Consul Barceló up for a little conversation and interaction with the audience. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And I I personally regret very much that the ambassador is not here, because I would like to discuss trade issues with him. He was the negotiator of the USMCA, right, the trade deal between Mexico and the U.S., and put in context the excellent remarks of Dr. Escalante and Consul Barceló as well. And we heard a lot about trade and how Mexico serves a little bit as a bridge, right? A bridge between what we will say right now are two poles of economic, political, and social and cultural, push in the world, right? And what I would like to just reflect on is how much of that bridge can break, can break by in different ways, right? It can be break by lack of action by Mexico, right? By not focusing on that, by that relationship, right? So that in that sense, it makes really quite a remark what Consul Barceló had been saying, right? That Mexico has been norteado, right? And then orientado, it really puts in context that, right? That if we get too norteados, we will, Mexican own actions can actually breach that. At the same time, I think there's actions from the side of China that can break that bridge, right? That will make countries in this position, in the position that have a somehow constrained sovereignty, right, of taking its own paths to take a position, right? So if China continues to support, let's say, Russia in its war against Ukraine, or continues defeating its own principle of territorial integrity by claiming or other territory beyond its current territory, right? Like in the southern part of the continent or in Taiwan. Well, it leaves less ability to Mexican leaders to act. But I think what it is really relevant for this audience to understand is how much the current rhetoric about China actually destroys the bridge from the top, right? When we talk about China in the US, it's always about, in this context of geoeconomics, in this context of trade relationships, in this context of investments and competition. And it's often, and that has been the case at least in the last 10 years, in a very negative way, right? And whether it's granted or not, that actually leaves very, it generates a very adverse relationship, right? Not only between the US and China, but also limits what other governments can do. And of course, Brazil, as Dr. Escalante was saying, or Argentina, they have much more ability to disassociate from that rhetoric, in part because they are more distant, they're less dependent on international trade, less dependent on other aspects with the US. But Mexico is much more constrained to that, right? So I think one of the first insights that I get from this conversation, and maybe we can analyze in the Q&A, is how much Mexico continues to be a bridge despite the US. Right? Because as Dr. Escalante was saying, yeah, I mean, it's so interesting, right? And I'm someone who studies international trade, that the deep links that you can find between the two countries, right? I remember exactly being in San Miguel de Allende not long ago, an exhibit of art, right? With exactly the same title, right? Paths Across the Pacific, right? That basically display the influence of art from China that basically came through the Philippines, right? Into the Mexican art, and I think the other way around, right? I mean that route has existed, and the constraints imposed by the relationship between Mexico and the U.S. may continue to degrade that basic relationship. And I'm going to give two examples, right, ways in which the breach that remains in existence, and we can explore more, are being affected by the position of the U.S. in terms of international trade. So one of them will be its position in the USMCA, right? The USMCA is this trade deal that links the US, Canada, and Mexico. And if you think about it, really, it's two bilateral relationships, Mexico and the US, and Canada and the US, and then maybe Mexico and Canada in a lesser extent. But one of the interesting aspects of the treaty is basically that if Mexico signs a deal in similar terms as with China, right, the US can demand the termination of the USMCA. Right, think about that, right, that concern. And of course, you can ask us, well, what really is the enforceability of that? Who really will enforce that? And by the way, that's the same for Canada. But why would the US limit the possibility of Mexico of acting, in like a breach in those terms by limiting the trade capacity that Mexico may have in that sense, right? So that's one example in which the breach can be broken in that direction. The other one is in the, and I think this is going to be more of an issue as the so-called nearshoring starts to happen, right? For those who may not follow all the conversations on international trade, that I assume is most of you, nearshoring is this aspect that we see more and more, that many foreign investors or American companies that were investing in China and relocating. And some of the destinations that they have chosen to relocate is actually Mexico, right? In part because, as it was pointed by Dr. Escalante, they can obtain some of the benefits and export to the US. Now, that will become an issue at some point, right? Because the more the Chinese companies in really sophisticated industries relocate, there will be an intense scrutiny about what is being made, where are the supply chains located, and what are actually the exports into the US. Then the last one is, and this is an issue that actually it's very interesting, is to what extent the US will permit that the foreign investors, right, of China or the Chinese government finance critical infrastructure in Mexico. Right? Think about that. I mean, the US can say, we don't want Chinese interests financing infrastructure in the US. And that's fine, they can do that, right? We don't want them involved in the ports because we feel like our ports have to be secure. And it has been doing it by a specific mechanism, right? And I won't bother you with that. But it has started to do this in more aggressive ways in limiting the ability of Mexico to actually procure services from China or accept foreign investment that is funded by China, right? So one example, and probably we can discuss that, is the recent issue of the processing of the passports, I believe, right? The processing of passports of Mexicans, in part because, think how many Mexicans actually have dual citizenships, or how many Americans actually can claim Mexican citizenship because they are sons or daughters of Mexican Americans, right? Both ways. And the other one, which is something that I won't discuss in full detail, but the famous collapse of the train, the high-speed train that was going to be the first rail in the Americas, the first high speed, and what was the concerns of the US of having the Chinese government funding the largest infrastructure project of Mexico during the Peña Nieto administration, that led into the collapse of that project. So with that, I will, welcome our speakers, and maybe we can have a debate about the bridge, how we can continue to build the bridge, and how to avoid that this bridge gets bombarded by overly aggressive American rhetoric around China. Thank you so much.
All right, so now we're going to have a little conversation between our guest presenters and each other, and then we'll open up the floor to questions and answers. We're lucky to have with us from the consul as well, the Deputy Consul Li Wang. Consul Barceló is preparing for a meeting, the first meeting with the governors of Arizona and Sonora, and they're meeting on Monday here in Tucson. He's on a call right now, but he should be back in a minute. But if not, then we have the expertise of his esteemed colleague. So we're going to turn it over to you guys to have a little conversation. Please use the microphones so the audience can hear, and for the recording upstairs.
Can you hear me? Okay. Sorry.
This one? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe we can use this. Okay. Maybe I can start with the first question for Dr. Escalante. So, you talk about a little bit of the shared values between Mexico and China, and I was intrigued, and my academic side wanted to explore more that idea, right? Where are those values? And I think, what do you think, what role they can play in this rather complex moment of geopolitical, tensions?
Thank you, Sergio, for the question. Well, I think these common values, especially regarding their own foreign policies and their own histories, like being respectful with sovereignty, and like if there's a way to cooperate, there's no intervention in internal issues. Mm-hmm. And I think this is a common ground for Mexico and China. No? The consul just said in his speech that Mexico doesn't really want to take sides, no? And I think it's in part because of these values. Of course, there are like other values, no, regarding internal policy. But in regarding foreign policy, I think these are very important because this can make at least Mexico and China cooperate in multilateral initiatives, like I mentioned very briefly, but like in climate change or other very important things that might not clash with the relation with the US, no? With the bilateral relation. So I think it's very important to make, how can I say it? Well, to make these values more evident and more open in the relationship. Of course, in discourse, in diplomatic discourse, it's very common, but like to really make them happen, no? To really enhance this opportunity. I don't like the word opportunities, you noticed, but well, how to use them better for the bilateral relation.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for that answer, and I will just your last name is Deputy Consul Wong, right? If I get it correct.
So before saying anything, I just want to make clear that this is a blatant example of racial profiling by Consul Barceló by throwing me in here.
Sorry.
So.
Yes, I'm of Chinese descent, and yes, my last name is Wang.
Okay, sorry. The thing is, I get distracted.
It's
sometimes.
uncommon. It's uncommon. I know.
So, Deputy Consul Wong, well, welcome and thank you so much for being here, and it's a pleasure to meet you. I will just then maybe hit you with right off the bat with like a tough question. So, is there any limits to that principle of no intervention, right, by Mexico? And I think you think like that carries a lot of water. I agree. I think that is like a way in which Mexico has to navigate this complex environment, because like really Mexico have had to serve as a bridge out of necessity in history, right? I mean, if Mexico was like an empire, right, or a real, a big player, right, maybe wouldn't have to play that role. But it's but what are the limits? So to what extent, I think, you think that can carry water in this relationship?
Well, I think that the limits are natural in the sense that we have to remember that this principle of non-intervention was included in the Mexican Constitution fairly recently. It was until 1989. But at the same time, it reflected a long tradition in the Mexican diplomacy as to all the process of decolonization that took place, guided by the United Nations, and certainly the navigation that our foreign policy did throughout the Cold War. So I would say that the limit to non-intervention is basically precisely what Consul Barceló was saying with other words, in the sense that if we seem to take part, or if we seem to take sides, then Mexico can no longer facilitate the dialogue in the multilateral or even bilateral level. So it's not a matter that we don't want to directly interfere just because we're afraid of a certain consequence. And I think that the Mexican history with Cuba during the Cold War and many other examples in Eastern Europe, and certainly now the case in China reflect precisely that Mexico is still looking to be that neutral entity, that reliable entity in the international system, and certainly something that sometimes is missed out of sight whenever we focus in this type of bilateral relationships is that the voice of Mexico is still very respected and has a very strong muscle in the United Nations systems, not only in the General Assembly or in the Security Council, but also in the different bodies that have to do with development, with culture, with the 2030 agenda. And the moment that we seem to lose that neutrality, then it's harder for Mexico just to achieve that goal of being really the space and the facilitator of that dialogue. So it's not something that, it's fixed. It's something more related to how we want to be perceived and how we honor that tradition that we've built throughout, I would say, since the end of the Mexican-American War.
So just to maybe summarize that excellent point, is a necessary element of Mexican multilateral diplomacy, right? Like despite whatever pressures, links with the U.S., they have to maintain this position, right, in some way to facilitate and grow its power within multilateral diplomacy. And that's a very interesting and good point. And I just, I was reminded that, yesterday we were having this conversation. Ambassador Seade himself actually positioned himself in that way when he ran as a candidate for the Director General of the World Trade Organization. The World Trade Organization is it's one of the few multilateral organizations that actually remain working in relatively functional ways despite everything, although not so much in the last 8 years or so, but that's a different story.
It's still alive.
It's still alive, yeah. And Ambassador Seade was one of the forerunners for the candidacy, and then that's precisely his speech, right? Like, so I am from an emerging economy that has studied and spent time in China. I know well the countries, and I negotiated the USMCA, right? So in a way that gave him a political clout. But sometimes it's not quite there, right? I mean, I think Mexico sometimes struggling to reposition in this relationship between this as a bridge, in part because, and this is the second leg of inquiry that I wanted to get, because the bridge also has to deal with another aspect of this relationship, which is the competition, right? Competing for interest, competing for a market in the U.S. One of the reasons, you quoted the 2003 change in balance in trade, that was restored soon after. But that was a consequence of the WTO joining, China joining the WTO. But who was the last member to approve the Chinese joining into the WTO? You probably know, Mexico, right? Mexico was the veto actor in that case because it was protecting what they knew it was going to lose. So in this context of also competition, right, for a market, for influence, for your perspective, what do you see are the main challenges of that relationship, the Chinese-Mexico relationship?
Yeah, well, thank you, Sergio, for this, for bringing up this topic again. Well, I think I'm not an economist. Sorry if I don't speak in proper language, but well, first, of course, from this economic perspective, Mexico and China are competitors in the U.S. market, yes. No, and even in the Mexican market. China is a competitor. That's why we see, well, not me, but like, well, we Mexicans see China as a threat because they're bringing products that are not complementary to our economy. No, there's just this competition. So in this sense, it's pretty hard to revert this unfavorable trade balance to Mexico, no, because there's no way we can just make it more complementary, no, our economies. This is on this side. And on the other side, of course, since the U.S. is our most important trading partner, and, well, not only trading, but our most important bilateral relation, then for Mexico, it's really hard to serve or to have this role as a bridge. Because, I mean, as I mentioned, some political issues, no, like our possible approachment to the BRICS or our possible membership in the Belt and Road Initiative, which is the most important initiative from China. It is because the U.S. is constantly like pressuring, no, and making us remember who is our most important relation, no? And what our consul just said, no? We're more norteados than anything, and it's a little bit hard to get out of that frame. And it's not that I advocate for like choosing China instead of the U.S. Of course not. Our natural relation is with the U.S., but still. I mean, what I'm trying to say, my main argument is to look for other ways to approach to China, not only on the commercial side, but other ways to make it more fruitful and to get more advantage from this relationship.
Well, thank you. And maybe I want to press if you can point into other ways in which you think that can work, right? I mean, other cultural, but how would that relation look?
Well, the ideal scenario, I think it would be like more cooperation in some multilateral scenarios. I think it's possible, and it's possible to make clear that we can have a more independent foreign policy, no, from the U.S. I think there is like one of the main points. And of course, taking advantage more of these cultural exchanges, the education. There are a lot of scholarships that, well, not as many as between the US and China, of course, but there are many scholarships between our two countries. And then sometimes the people that study in China, well, as I did, we go back to Mexico and, well, very good. Are you studying in China? Very good. And that's all. There's not like this follow-up from the government, no, to attract this experience. Not me. I mean, I was lucky that I'm at UNAM right now, no. But other people, businessmen that know a lot about China. They've lived in China like 10 years and they're not very connected to the government. So what I see and what I expect to see in the next 50 years is this more this approachment and more this consciousness of what is valuable for our two countries. No?
Thank you so much. Consul, you want to add something about this idea of the competition and also what other avenues beyond, the economic ones?
Sure. So what I would suggest is that we need to look into the narrative that surrounds the China-Mexico relationship. And I think that the audience just felt that, that in our minds as Mexicans, we don't conceive that there is a Chinese descent population in Mexico. And I think it's particularly relevant because we're in Arizona. And there is a large Chinese descent population, not only in Sonora, but also in Baja California and also in Chihuahua. You touched on that when you reviewed that historic part, and you're absolutely right. I think that what we see now is that remnant of a very aggressive U.S. immigration policy, these ideas of the whiteness, this idea that we needed to close the ports to the yellow thread, and it was, sadly, something that we still see in our days. But differently from the US, which has had different cultural stages, if you will, the notion of what it means to be Asian, and I say Asian, not even Chinese in Mexico, is still very ingrained in our society. To the extent that if you go, maybe not anymore in Mexico City, but certainly in the rest of the country, if you go there and you say, I'm from Korea or I'm from Japan, they will simply call you, you're a Chinese, right? You're a Chinaman. So narrative is very important. We need to review that because the reality is there. I mean, it's our largest second partner when it comes to trade. We have an important dialogue in multilateral level. So once you address that narrative, you can start to break down the other parts. You were mentioning correctly that we were the last country vetoing the entrance or the admittance of China into the World Trade Organization. And when you look into the detail of that, Mexico, veto after veto, and this was done through the Ministry of Economy, the Federal Ministry of Economy, sat down with the particular sectors of our economic activity that we're concerned with having Chinese competition. And one by one, they were solved. One by one, they were tackled. And the last veto, and it lasted maybe 3 votes of Mexico in the WTO, was the shoemaking companies, right? Yeah. And the reason for that is it was a very touchy issue because it meddled with the notion that we as Mexicans had of, no, wait a minute. I have a long history of shoemaking, and the central part of the country, Guanajuato, Querétaro, all of that region, comes from this almost 17th century technique that, has been thriving since then, and how are you on earth going to allow this unfair competition? And it was unsustainable, because they were given enough advice, they were giving the input from the government, they had all the tools to modernize, just to adapt their industry to the current times, and they didn't. But still, the sensitivity of this narrative of the Mexican government produced 3 more vetoes. And I think that this is the last thing I'll add to that, that it also reflects how difficult it is in our globalized world. And I don't mean that as a cliche, but it really reflects the difficulty of government entities to address the request of each of the small atoms that now have to do with our bilateral or trilateral or triangular relationship. And it's easy to see that perhaps when you have a trade policy that will affect importers and will benefit exporters, because the public opinion and the media will always will have mixed feelings, right? So the exporters will be happy if you have a pro-export policy, but then the people who are importing will say, oh no, this is the worst government that we've had. And I think that happens a lot with China and Mexico, not because we look for it, but because we're so integrated with the US economy. And that is precisely what has been mentioning here. There is no way that we can just stop that, or that the government entities can somehow channel that. In fact, we have tried to do that. And that's why we have so many free trade agreements, not only with Israel and Central America, but virtually with countries that don't have that strong relationship, even historically speaking, with Mexico. Because at some point the government said, we're too dependent on the US economy. We need to diversify this. But the reality is still out there, and the US is our main trading partner, not because the governments want, but because that's where the money is. And so you can only do so much when it comes to guide that. But if it's so atomized, then it's even harder.
Yeah, and I think that brings the element of competition. It's more difficult. I mean, there is a lot of competition between the 2 countries. So let me just open this, and then I wanted to finalize one exploration, the topic of, you raised the issue of fentanyl and the issue of well, these more complicated issues, right? But we can do that. But first, I want to see if there's any questions from the audience, and I have Charles Wang, and then some other. Maybe we can go ladies first. Yeah.
Well, first of all, thank you so much. I feel very honored to be here. This question goes along to what you guys were just speaking about. I wrote it. What are the potential opportunities and challenges for deeper economic and political relationship between Mexico and China, and how might these two countries navigate them in the coming years?
Well, I would just start with one. I think taking advantage of what I refer as nearshoring that is already happening, right? Relocation of businesses, right, outside of China, right? I mean, just think of Apple manufacturing and all the supply chains, and I think many of them will have, for sure, components of Chinese industries and Chinese production that I think very much could easily relocate to Mexico and take advantage of that. I think that's, for me, the most obvious one right now. Should be an active process by both Secretaría de Economía and SRE, and then complemented with, I think, what you were saying, like with other elements of that tie this a little bit beyond just the manufacturing aspect. But
Yeah, well, I already mentioned maybe some, but I will add, and put emphasis on one aspect, and there are a lot of institutions and mechanisms between Mexico and China already, but I think we haven't really taken advantage of them. So, like, my suggestion or my projection would be really taking advantage of them. We have a strategic partnership, which is really important, but we don't really do much about them. I mean, we do, of course, but we should do a lot more, because we already have these institutions and mechanisms. We don't need to create more and to sign more treaties, and we don't, because we have enough. So that would be my recommendation.
I agree, and when it comes to the political side of it, I think that the role of Mexico should be to try to explain to the best of our extent to the U.S. what is the view of China. And what I mean by that is, if you look at the U.S. press, and when it comes to this, challenge or sort of forever tension between the two countries, or whether one is trying to tackle down the other, I never see the Chinese perspective, in the sense that, just like we reviewed this part of history, the Chinese still have a sense of grievance, not so much against the U.S., but against the Western powers. And if you look at what happened with the fall of the Qing dynasty, it's completely understandable and justifiable that these people are trying to, return to their legitimate place in the world, what they conceive to be their legitimate place in the world. And I also see that not often it is mentioned that the Chinese have been trying to do that without going to war or open conflict, which is something that not every country is willing to do. So I think that Mexico can certainly help position that because of our privileged dialogue with the U.S. I do believe that we have those mechanisms already in place, but I also believe that we need to have more retention of talents when it comes to both companies and the federal government and the state and the municipal government to understand what we want from China. Because, and this is not something that just affects our relationship with them, but every 6 years and every change in local governments, municipal governments, whatever knowledge we might have acquired when it comes to international relations is often lost because we don't retain those people. So if you put that in the Chinese perspective, they do conceive them as a very long line of history. And it's certainly something that did not start just after the Cold War or after the end of the war with Japan. They really trace back themselves so much more. So when you start to identify those differences in their political views, then I think that the rest will come naturally. And in the economic perspective, I think that the way to navigate that is just to understand that the market will find itself. And what I mean by that is certainly we'll have cases where Mexico will have to do 2 or 3 times the effort to explain to the U.S. why we want certain type of investment, or why certain type of infrastructure is adequate or beneficial for us. But we need to listen to the US as well, because both sides have legitimate concerns. When the US says, I do have what I believe are attacks by the Chinese in terms of espionage or in terms of software and ransomware and so on, we need to listen to them, because at the end of the day, Mexico is part and is conceiving itself as part of North America. And we need to do the same whenever the Chinese say, no, this is not a fair play. What they're doing is trying to use, for example, national security as an excuse to tamper with our iron exports. So that's not fair. So again, that's why I was saying that Mexico cannot seem to take sides, and we need to look ourselves into this longer concept of the Chinese, and at the same time be that bridge with the practicality that the U.S. Is always trying to have in their negotiation tables.
Now, Charles.
All right, we'll have time for one last question, and then we'll wrap it up because we have limitations on the building and the time. But we have Associate President for China.
And we have a reception after that.
Yeah, we're going to roll up the doors here in a minute and have a reception outside so we can continue the conversation in smaller groups. But we'll have one last large conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. I take the pride. Yeah, it's this fantastic presentation and talk and a timely topic, right? So I just came back from China, just about 1 month ago. What I experienced while in China, I was in China, just really some dark days and some bright days. It kind of aligned with when the Chinese government lifted all the restrictions on COVID measures. And also the rhetoric and narratives, with the Western world towards China also changed and transformed, along the line. So I remember when Biden administration just walking in the White House there, when Secretary Blinken released his policy towards China, is basically the core is the 3 C's: competition and collaboration and confrontation. Mm-hmm. So now we see the first, the competition and collaboration is gone. We see the more and more some countries, particularly for the allies of the United States, take their first 2 C's: competition and collaborate with China. So particularly after when they say that China right now just opened the border, just economic performance really just better than they expected. So now, you talk about a lot about the triangle, relationship in U.S. and Mexico and China, and we will see more and more, other countries play a role in this equation. So how much will this affect the Mexican government's decision, navigate, the relationship with China? Yeah.
So if I want to summarize, how does the U.S., how does Mexico will deal with this situation, right? Forcing between, to move into this confrontation, right? So 2 seconds, right? What Mexico should be doing right now to avoid getting to that? Because I think that is, an important thing, right? If Mexico gets to the confrontation side, it loses its bridge, right? So.
Well, that's a very difficult question to reply, but I would say to have a more or less independent foreign policy, as long as it's possible, of course, and to follow our own principles. No, I mean, if China is doing something that is not proper for Mexico, then just don't accept it. But if the U.S. is not doing that either, I mean, it sounds pretty easy, of course, and naive as well. But that's what I would think. No.
Back to values, right?
Yeah, back to values. Yeah.
So.
And in 2 seconds, I would say that Mexico needs to stick to its interest. And the noble part of this is that our genuine interest is to have peace and to have dialogue and to have trade and to have security. And again, I think that we can be that broker between the U.S. and China from our particular perspective. I would certainly bet a lot on exchanges, because in that way, and this is just a quick story, this is already happening. In our consulate here, I see a lot of students from all over the world, but certainly China, who want a Mexican visa because they're already studying here in the University of Arizona, or they're working here in Arizona, and they just want to visit Mexico. That's what I'm talking about. And I guess that in the immediate or immediate term, Mexico just need to be present, and perhaps that's our mistake right now that we shy away from what we believe can be a contentious relationship when we should be doing completely the opposite, just like here, addressing these topics. You know, if we want to talk about fentanyl, if we want to talk about cybersecurity, if we want to talk about trade, if we want to talk about national security, we can certainly do that because we know the Americans and we can know the Chinese people too.
Well, Ambassador Wong, and I would call you ambassador in a way of projecting because I'm here. Your career has a lot of really exciting future, and you're certainly very talented. And especially to Dr. Escalante, thank you so much. This was wonderful. Thank you for being here and for launching this wonderful series of paths across the Pacific. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, all three of you. I really appreciate your time and your participation today. Thank you all for being here. We're going to open the door outside, so it'll be noisy for about a minute or two while it beeps and opens. But if you haven't already signed in to register, please do and get your tickets there for the drinks out at the bar. And we're going to start the reception now. And we have time to talk with our speakers a little bit more outside and mingle and chat and enjoy ourselves. So please stick around for the reception.